Hello everybody and welcome to this third webinar today from ISO Technical Committee 283, Occupational Health and Safety Management. This afternoon's session will look at whether our standards from this committee are really protecting every worker, and do we need to evolve them to make sure we don't leave anybody behind. We're just going to give it another moment or so while people are still joining us, and then we will go to some housekeeping and make a start. Okay, let's have a look at the basic housekeeping. This is a listen-only webinar, so you won't unfortunately be able to verbally talk to us during this session. However, we do want it to be as interactive as possible, so please put questions and comments in via the Q&A function. We'll answer the live questions throughout the webinar, so please don't wait until the end to put something in. As the conversation flows, we will bring you in. If you have any technical difficulties, please also use that Q&A function, and our technical team who is sitting in the background will do their very best to help you. This is a CPD recognised event. You'll receive a survey after the event and you can request a certificate via that. After you've completed the survey, you'll also get the slides and access to the recording, and all of the webinars that have gone on today and will go on tomorrow will be available on demand. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panel of speakers today. I'm Sally Swindwood. I'm the Committee Manager for the Occupational Health and Safety Management Committee, ISO TC 283, and I am a Lead Standards Development Manager for the UK standards body, BSI. Now, if Mike, Catherine and Martin would like to turn their cameras on, please. Fantastic, thank you. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself? Mike, you're muted.
Perhaps not the last time. Sally, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. As way of background, briefly, I'm an industrial hygienist located in the US. I've been doing industrial hygiene for 40 or so years, and I spent most of my career working either as a contractor or as an employee in the Occupational Safety and Health Administration here in the US. I've been a member of the US Technical Advisory Committee to TC 283 since its beginning in 2013. And when I was working at OSHA, I was their project manager on virtually all the projects that had to do with management systems.
Thanks very much, Mike. And now if Catherine, you would like to introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sally. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this webinar. My name is Catherine Binke. I'm working at ETOC, and that is the European Trade Union Confederation. We represent European workers across Europe, so from 90 different trade union organizations in 39 countries. And we do a lot at the level of legislative making and collective agreements, but we also follow a couple of standards. So we represent European workers in standardization, mainly European standards, but also international standards. And I'm following and coordinating a selection of standards in the field of OH, but also governance, human resource management, services, some sector-specific standards. And yes, that is what we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Great to have you here too. Martin, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Sally. And hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar and a warm welcome. I'm Martin Cottam. I'm the chair of ISO TC 283. I've been involved with occupational health and safety management standards for just about 25 years now, both at national level here in the UK and internationally. I chaired the BSI Mirror Committee and led the UK delegation through the development of ISO 45001, and after that became the chair of TC 283 when the committee was formed in 2018. My background's actually in major hazard risk assessment, originally in the nuclear industry and then later in the oil and gas and shipping industries and some other sectors. And then my career evolved increasingly in the direction of quality management, and I ended my 31-year career at Lloyd's Register as the group's technical assurance and quality director.
Thank you very much, Martin. So let's get into our discussions. We're going to begin by a general question. ISO 45001 is a generic standard, as all ISO management system standards are intended to be. It should be applicable to every organisation, no matter what they're doing or where they are or how big they are, and it should protect every worker. So why are we having this discussion, Martin? What is the issue?
I think the issue is, Sally, that the theory sounds straightforward when you describe it like that. But actually, for us as standards writers, I think there is a challenge in actually achieving that objective of writing documents which are genuinely applicable and accessible to that full range of organizations, types of organization that we wish to have use them, and that particularly includes smaller organizations. And I think also in our efforts to produce reasonably concise standards, sometimes we find it very difficult to convey some of the important detail, particularly around inclusivity, and some of those key messages then tend to get lost, and users fail to appreciate the message that we're trying to convey. I mean, the remit of our committee, to be clear, is worker OH&S, full stop. You know, that means everybody. And to be effective as a committee, supporting improvement in global OH&S performance, we really do have to be capable of influencing and helping organizations of all types. And smaller organizations represent a challenge in that respect, but they also represent a substantial part of the global economy. A high proportion of workers across the globe are actually employed in small and micro organizations. So we have to find a way to be effective in supporting that type of organization. And we also have to be effective in addressing some of the inequalities which exist in the workplace and which need to be called out and challenged to help organizations address some of these equalities where they relate specifically to OH&S.
Thank you, Martin. And I'm obviously going to come to Mike. Mike is leading a new task group in our technical committee, which is looking at small businesses and micro businesses in particular, really, to see what we can do. How can we help them? Mike, what's the major concern here? What do you see as the problems?
Thank you, Sally. That's an important question. First, I see two major concerns. I see resources as a concern, and those resources include both time and money. And in my opinion, time is the issue here that makes it so that smaller organizations have a difficult time implementing some of the standards that we write. You know, the owners of small organizations, they're often the most important, most productive employee in their organization. You know, they're the master bricklayer, they're the master carpenter or electrician. They are the chef and they serve the food. Okay, and so it's important that they do a myriad of other things that small businesses do, and they are the people who are actually on the front lines doing the work in addition to managing the business. And that's an important thing to recognize. So in their spare time, the business owners do the bills. They try to get paid by their clients. They repair equipment. They try to hire and train competent workers. And if there's any other time left over, they spend their time thinking about how innovative ways to build their business and make their business better. And so I think that we must be sensitive to the amount of time of theirs that we take up when we write our standards, to make sure that they are not put off by a large document that is difficult perhaps for them to read, and if they don't read it, their workers won't have the protection that the management systems will provide. Second, the smaller organizations don't really have the expertise to interpret the complex language and jargon that we as safety and health professionals often use. And that's important. So to reach this audience, we need to write clear, focused, action-oriented requirements, and have those requirements be those that are most effective for achieving the goal of protecting workers. The other thing that we have to recognize is that there will never be enough safety and health professionals to help 400 million small organizations interpret and implement our management system standards. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to come now to you, Katrin, as a representative of an organisation that represents workers. Who do you think is getting left behind? Where are the gaps? Where do your members see gaps in protection, health and safety protection for them?
Thank you, Sally. I start off with something positive, and that's the clause 5.4 on consultation and participation of workers. This is something which has been very much welcomed by the trade union movement to be part of the OH management standard, because it's so important to involve worker representatives, because workers are the frontliners, if you wish. They know of all the risk, they know of all the hazards, they know the things that management wouldn't necessarily see on the first sight, and they also know about solutions to all the problems, and they are the ones who can help very much in translating the requirements into the organizational context. And that is where we see the biggest challenge with ISO 45001 is that clause is not clear enough. It's not clear enough. For example, there was the 2020 user survey from ISO on asking the users of ISO 45005 how they're doing in implementing that standards and where they see challenges or problems. And very often the answer was that this part on worker participation was not clear. And if something is not clear, do you implement it well? And we still see and hear reports from work councils that when you have an organization and it implements the ISO 45001, worker representatives are still not properly involved in all that process. Starting the moment the company buys the standard and tries to implement it until the auditing process. So there's a lack of understanding, and this is really a pity because we have a lot of know-how from the workers that would get lost. So something that could be changed in the standard is definitely more clarity on what the role of the worker representative is and what he or she can do. This is something forward. And then there's some other points, maybe more stronger requirements on the use of PPE, and that it should be without any cost to workers. And there could also be more clearance or more clarity on the workplace definition, or even a definition on the worker representative, that would help. And we also see a couple of gaps, but I think we address that later in the webinar, on new forms of work that have, let us say, maybe have been before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic became more obvious, and we need to address that in ISO 45001. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And now I want to have a look at a specific group of workers. And perhaps this will come as a surprise to some of our users, but ISO research has shown that women and girls are often left behind when it comes to health and safety management. They're around half of the global workforce. So why is this happening? Why is it a problem? Why is it different to male workers? Katrin, maybe you could pick that up first, please.
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, I think the most important issue to understand is that gender equality shouldn't be looked at isolated, shouldn't be looked in isolation. It should be linked together with OSH issues, because when we have women and men, there are different issues in terms of OSH that we need to pay attention to. And I'm just giving two really good examples. There is one standard I've been working on, and it was published 1 year ago. And it was a guidance standard. It used to be a guidance standard, but they made it a guidance and requirement standards for organizations that are carer inclusive. And it basically means it's guidelines for organizations that have workers having a normal job in the company, but also having to take care of someone at home. It could be an older parent who needs care, or in a child that is sick for a long time or has a disability. And these workers were actually doing 2 jobs, but just one of them is paid, have other OSH issues or something more in addition. And the standard was very well written in the sense that it was saying, it was connecting the dots between what other additional needs do these worker carers have, and what other issues we need to address within the organization. So for example, someone that needs to work from 9 to 5 in a shop carrying a lot of heavy stuff, but then goes home and the whole night having to take care of a child that is sick, is physically exhausted, may need to have more breaks. And when you have to worry day and night about a parent at home, you will bring a huge burden that is on your mental health to the workplace. So the standard did very well giving guidance, so guidelines on what a company can do. And another one, I'm also working on another ISO standard that's on gender equality. It's in a newly set up PC 337. And they are addressing gender equality, doing the same, not looking at gender equality in, let's say, in a silo, but connecting the dots to all the different levels of an organization, including OSH. And they're giving very practical advice. And one advice is, and that's maybe also relevant for the work we're doing on the ISO 45000X, and that is whenever you set up a panel, or be it for human resource management or be it for OSH, so for example, the health and safety committee you set up in a company, put a woman there, because she will know what to do. She will know what a company can offer if a woman is pregnant, if a woman needs to breastfeed. Sometimes it doesn't need to be major changes. Sometimes it's just small steps. But having a woman in a committee can help a lot, because they know. And it's easier for women maybe to talk to another woman, or having a woman as a trust person. So that can do a lot. Yes, so there a lot of good standards work has been done already. It's there. We just need to streamline it and cross-reference to other standards that maybe do not deal with gender equality in the first place, But OSH is related also to gender equality. And when a crisis is happening, like the pandemics, let's not throw it overboard like we did with the pandemic on COVID-19, but stick to the good practices we have and a lot of standards already. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrin, and that's really interesting. I mean, it's really heartening to know that work is going on to try and address that imbalance, that inequality. But Martin, in our own management system standard in ISO 45001, do you think there is a value if, when it is revised, we address the lack of explicit direction, explain better the risks, understanding or signposting to women's health issues? Is there an issue with the kind of roles women take in many parts of the world or the type of employment they have?
Well, certainly, Sally, we know from relatively recent ISO research that when we resort to very generic phrases to capture, rather than providing a series of explicit examples, a proportion of standards users just don't get the message that we're trying to convey. And so, you know, the best example, of course, is the phrase "considering the needs of all workers." We've peppered this phrase through our standards, very often putting it there towards the end of a series of revisions, where in the earlier revisions we had very specific examples of considering the needs of women workers, of workers with disabilities, of older workers, of younger workers, to call out those specific things that an organisation might need to think about and remind them of it. And then in the interests of an economical, efficient text, we think, well, should we have all these examples repeated through the document? Let's just put considering the needs of all workers. And then we discover through the research that actually organisations may miss that important message and not think of those examples for themselves. So, I mean, I think that's been a really important piece of research by ISO. It specifically included research on our standard, but it went a lot wider. But certainly, since it did include research on our standard, we should take the message to heart and be more explicit in addressing that in a future revision. I would very much recommend. I think also, you know, we also need to think about, as you alluded to it, the fact that there are certain sectors of the economy where there are perhaps disproportionately more female workers, just as there are other sectors which are biased more towards men. I mean, I'm thinking perhaps just at the moment, because we've had recent conversations about it, about the gig economy and more informal sectors of the economy more widely. And they are of themselves a challenge from an OH&S perspective. Our reach as standards writers into those sectors has been perhaps a little bit limited. You know, we can be talking about work which is essentially unregulated from a health and safety perspective when we're talking about the informal sectors in some developing countries. Or, of course, we can be talking about flexible employment arrangements and 0 hours contracts that we're seeing taking hold and gain popularity in the developed world. And those are sectors, in fact, where there are significant numbers of women working, and our standards are not particularly effective in addressing those needs. And yet, you know, I think back to the last face-to-face meeting of our committee in Kigali, Rwanda, before the start of the global pandemic. And there, you know, we heard some great examples, in fact, presented to us by female colleagues, I might add, about efforts which were being made in some of the African countries to improve OH&S in the informal sectors of the economy. And they were not complex initiatives, and they were not expensive initiatives, but I know it came as quite a surprise to some of our delegates, particularly from the developed world, to see, you know, these initiatives being taken and the success that they were having. So it can be done. But I think, you know, we need to work actively to really explore how to improve the uptake and usage, and perhaps starting even from the awareness of our standards in some of these sectors, because otherwise we can have all the, you know, we can do all the work we want on getting the message right, but if we can't get the standard into the hands of people who will find it appealing and be able to use it, then we're not going to achieve our objectives.
Absolutely, and that's a slightly different question than the gender equality one, isn't it? But it's absolutely fundamental. We need to reach people. We might write the most perfect documents in the world, but if nobody's reading them, we're not helping people. And that, you know, again, Mike, in small businesses, is gender an issue in health and safety? I mean, I'm aware that in many small businesses, individuals wear a lot of hats. They have a lot of different responsibilities, and particularly with family-owned organisations, there's a lot of casual labour. Does gender come into this? How they look at people, how they look after people?
That's a great question, Sally. Thank you. You know, absolutely. But let's start this conversation a little bit by talking about women-owned businesses. In our last discussion, we talked about the time constraints of business owners and their various activities. And it seems to me that when a woman owns the business, these time constraints become even more acute often. You know, in addition to all those things that I described about running the business and getting paid and trying to figure out how to hire employees, et cetera, a woman in business has the added time pressure of taking care of a home often, you know, and raising children and other family responsibilities, as Katrine alluded to. And those time constraints make it even more difficult for a woman owning a small business to take the extra time to read a complex standard, even though perhaps she understands that it's important for her business, but finding the time to make it happen is likely to be very, very difficult. Okay, and then the other side of your question has to do with workers that are in you know, that are employed in small organizations. One of the things that has always occurred to me in the field work that I've done throughout my career is how much workplaces are designed for working men, and not particularly well designed for working women. Let me give you an example. I've seen factory settings where the work table is designed for a man's stature, his size, his height, and you know, women typically are not quite as tall as men, and so the extra couple of inches or so that the work table is higher for a woman can have a large impact on their ergonomic health, if you will. That puts them at greater risk of ergonomics injuries. It makes them have their arms over their heads much more often than men. You know, so in the design of workplaces, you know, we need to take into account this fundamental difference between men and women. And in my opinion, in 45,001, we allude to that, but don't take it on particularly straight, you know, head on. And so I think that we need to deal with that reality of the workplace that has been that way for you know, many decades and longer than that. The other issue that I think is important is that women are often and frequently the target of intimidation and harassment in the workplace, and the toll this can take on their psychological health and safety can be profound. and it really does disadvantage many women in how they proceed in their workplace, how they succeed, and how well they succeed, and how they relate to their coworkers. So I think the more recent focus on psychological health and safety really has will need to have a focus on women's issues. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Mike. And I think you've raised more questions for me. There's a question from our audience saying it's difficult to use more inclusive language in a revised 45,001. And would it be sensible to consider some separate specific guidance and examples on how the needs of all workers can be considered in an OH&S management system? And I was thinking, when you were talking, Mike, you have just suggested maybe we need specific gender guidance. But when you were describing the physical workplace and the physical gender differences, that of course doesn't just relate to women, does it? Different ethnicities are different sizes. Men's height generally varies a great deal anyway, as does women. So it's not as narrowly delineated as we think it is. Katrin talked about PPE a minute ago, and we know that personal protective equipment is designed for an average man of European build. That's excluding a lot of people, right? In terms of making sure things are properly fitted and doing what they need to do. I mean, Martin, do you think this is a path that the committee should consider going in? Specific guidance documents for specific groups of people or topics where diversity can have an issue on health and safety management?
Possibly, Sally, would be my answer. And the reason I say that is because we know that very often the take-up of guidance standards is less than that of the requirement specifications like ISO 45001. And so while in many ways I'm sympathetic obviously to the underlying principle, my concern is if we allow ourselves to kind of almost duck the issue in the requirement specification and say, well, there's plenty of guidance somewhere else, what proportion of our user community follows that through and takes action upon it? So I think we have to get the balance right, because a requirement specification exists, you know, it has more influence than anything else that we produce as a committee. And if we have important messages to deliver, that should be in many cases, that's the starting point, is to make sure that we are more explicit, I would suggest, in the requirement specification. But it doesn't mean that we litter the requirement specification with all the answers to all the questions that may then trigger in our user's mind. You know, we support ISO 45001 with a handbook tailored for smaller organizations, in which we're able to use somewhat more informal language. We're freer in the way we set things out. We also are just close to the point of publication later this year of ISO 45002, a more generic guidance standard. So we shouldn't miss those opportunities to use supporting guidance, but not at the expense of dealing with weaknesses where we recognize them in our requirement specification. So that's the way I would view it.
Thank you. Can I remind everybody to mute themselves when they're not speaking, please? I just wanted to come back to Katrin before we move off. From a union point of view, would it be helpful for more of these issues to be explicitly mentioned in the requirements document rather than in separate documents? Is that something that the unions would support?
So if Martin says that requirements documents are selling much better than guidance documents or supporting handbooks, then maybe it's an idea to put indeed much more into the requirement documents. You don't have to litter maybe the standard. You could also put it into an annex, an informative annex. But what I've seen is that so very often, not just with ISO 45001, but sometimes requirements are not clear and they're not being clearly implemented. They're taking measures thinking, oh, I think we now do what the standard is telling us, but in the end, it's not really right. So, and what the two standards I was mentioning before we're doing is just putting after every set of requirements or every set of guidance, they would put a couple of examples. And yes, of course, a company, so the requirements need to be generic in a way that it should be applicable for all organizations. But sometimes it's helpful to have examples to give some illustrations, to give some examples. This is how we did, to give some best practices. This is how we did, and it's working fine. Maybe this is something for your organization as well. And what is also very helpful then, if you take the case of women, to look and see what other ISO standards have been doing on that. So the two standards I mentioned, they write about OH, and they even reference ISO 45001. And there's a lot of, if I can say, food for thought for ISO 45000X. So a lot of stuff they mentioned there in the standard could be somehow referenced or even reused in the ISO 45000X. And but not just on women, there's also a human resource management standard on diversity and inclusion, and it's also mentioning OSH, so it has some good idea which we could use or use as inspiration of when we revise or when we write ISO 45000X standards. But coming back to your question, I think it's better to put it all in one document, because if the chance is higher, if there are more requirements documents sold and you have a full package, everything into one standard, then I would put it definitely in one document. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Katrine. That's really interesting. Martin, I know you want to come back on this.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Sally, that also we should remind ourselves and make the comment for our listeners as well, that as a committee, we don't see ourselves as a document factory. You know, that is not the purpose for which we exist, to create and publish documents. You know, our objective is to have impact. And particularly, I think, when we're talking, for example, about influencing smaller organizations, we need to be very mindful of the cost of standards charged effectively by the page. And I think that there is more that we can do at a committee level. You know, Katrin makes a great point about the value of examples, but we don't have to put the examples into a published text. You know, I think there's a lot more potential for us as a committee, for example, to make use of the committee website. We've talked on previous occasions about providing collateral, things that could be downloaded, or indeed just material that can be consulted on the website. And I think that when we're talking about parts of our audience which are difficult to reach, we need to also be mindful that one of the reasons that they may be difficult to reach is the cost element, and that we're not constrained to charge for everything that we create as information that can be shared. We can also share things freely, and of course, to be fair, Standards also has had a good reputation in recent times for making content that would normally be chargeable freely available. That was certainly done extensively during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think in relation to climate change, there are similar moves afoot. So I think we need to be open to a wider range of mechanisms to share our ideas and to influence people, and not necessarily default entirely to the sort of formal standards element of our those are just some of our options.
And this would be a great opportunity to hear from you, the audience. Use that Q&A box. Let us know what you think is the right way forward. What would be helpful to you? Would it be to build much more into 45001, even though we know that that will drive the cost up, certainly in some standards bodies, but is it better to have it all in one place? Do you prefer separate guidance documents in addition? Would you prefer white papers, examples, text on a website? What would you like? What would help you? And this is very much one of the reasons we're running these webinars. We want your feedback. We want more interaction with you, please. The people that make the decisions in TC283, the people that develop the documents, we're just like you. We are workers in organisations too. We are trying to find what works for as many people as possible. To Martin's point, our remit is not just to churn out more and more standards. So in 10 years' time, we have 100 standards. What we're aiming for is to improve health and safety performance across the world. If we can do that with the existing standards that we already have, fantastic. Let's see what we can do. So please do let us have your views as we're talking. We really do want to hear from you. So let's go on to the next slide, please. And we've already touched on this. Martin, you mentioned the gig economy and 0 hours contracts, that kind of thing, a few minutes ago. But our world of work is changing, isn't it? And we still have perhaps a somewhat traditional view of occupational health and safety management, with a mental picture of how an organisation has been in the past, rather than reflecting what it may look like now. What are some of the issues that you think we need to be addressing there, and that may be able to be picked up in future revisions of a document, or on the website, or in social media, wherever we disseminate information?
Well, I think, Sally, you know, if you look at the population of those of us who are involved in standards writing, and I include in that, of course, not just the representatives from 99 countries who are involved directly in our technical committee, and the international liaison organisations who also contribute, including Catherine's organisation, the ETUC, but also at national level. National input is developed through mirror committees, which can number a small number of people, up to, I think in the case of the US, Mike, you have over 100 people in the committee that contributes. You know, we represent a huge stakeholder network, but my suspicion is that if you did the analysis on that network of people, perhaps taking into account the demographic, you would see that, you know, a lot of us, our experience is in traditional businesses, and relatively few representatives will have direct experience of organizations in the gig economy or in the more informal sectors. And so in some ways, I think that's where perhaps our challenge begins, because we need, first and foremost, I think, in my view, more engagement with those sectors to improve and increase our understanding of how they operate from an OH&S perspective, and what challenges they face, and to what extent, therefore, our documents do or do not meet their needs. I think, you know, we're only in the early stages of what I hope will be a very positive engagement, in fact, with actors in the gig economy and the informal sectors. And at the moment, we're still at that point of exploration. You know, there are perceptions, I think, on their side that our standards don't quite apply to them. And that may be to do with language, and it may be that through dialogue, we come to the conclusion that the problem isn't quite as initially perceived. Not that said, I'd still be a little bit surprised if we emerge from that conversation at the other end saying, well, actually, isn't that lovely? Our standard perfectly met the needs of these actors right from the start. It was purely that, you know, we and they didn't realize it. I think there will be challenges. And from my point of view, back to the remit of the committee, if we need a different approach, different documents, that will help those organizations to drive OH&S performance and performance improvement, then we will have to wrestle with the challenges of, well, you know, how do you reconcile the consistency between the existing standard and something that new tailored to the sector. But I'd much rather wrestle with that challenge than the challenge of ignoring a growing and important sector of the economy, where I think there are OH&S challenges, and clearly from the approaches that we are seeing, there is a willingness to try and do more, but perhaps a degree of uncertainty as to what form that should take, and whether our standards are part of the solution. We absolutely need to be part of the solution.
Thanks, Martin. Mike, can we have a conversation, a little bit more thought about non-traditional models of working in terms of hierarchy? Management system standards like ISO 45001 put a lot of emphasis on this phrase top management, the decision makers in the organisation. But there is a real trend going on, has been going on for some time, to have far less hierarchical, flatter structures in organisations. So you can't point to, that's the boss, he makes the decisions, perhaps in the way that we used to. Do you think we need to evolve our language and the way we approach things to reflect this flatter decision-making structure that more and more organisations are using?
Well, Sally, that's an interesting question. I do agree with you that we tend to address top management in the standards that we are currently writing, and I think the hierarchical approach reflects how many businesses are organized, and so in that way it seems a natural thing to do. But if you take a look at that, I tend to take a look at it as is the top management the coach, or is the top management part of the team? And I believe that safety and health management systems in particular, and I suspect management systems in general, work better when it's a team effort. And I think the responsibilities of top management are to remove the obstacles to having that team be effective. So if there are obstacles to reporting injuries and illnesses, for example, top management needs to remove those obstacles. They need to provide leadership. I don't think they need to provide direction, because I think as a team, an organization can find its own direction and find its own direction in the right way. One of the things I wanted to ask about and talk about a little bit is something that Martin said in response to your last slide, in that you had asked Sally, you'd asked the participants to give us an opinion about what might make better sense with respect to our presentation and the organization of our standards. And I wanted to agree with Martin that we really do need to think seriously about whether our standards really reflect the needs of all of the organizations. In my case, I feel the small organizations are my passion, if you will. But if it takes different language, if it takes a shorter standard, if it takes different requirements, for example, documentation requirements that are fairly heavily sprinkled within 45001 and perhaps are somewhat daunting for smaller organizations, perhaps we should take a look at those requirements and really only require those actions that are needed to be effective in having a management system in the context of the audience that we're addressing. So in many ways, I personally am an advocate of a separate requirement standard for small organizations. And I feel that way because a requirement standard is a driver. where an organization can choose to not purchase, if you will, or ignore a guidance because it doesn't seem to be quite so important. But requirement standards are a driver for performance. Organizations, in the case of small organizations, I'm hoping that at some point we have many small organizations who are seeking certification. Okay, and the question is, do we disadvantage them in that process by using language that is much more appropriate for larger organizations than for how they operate? You know, so that's one of the questions that's been going around in my mind for, frankly, quite a number of years. But I also see that we write standards and we kind of ignore a tension between achieving the clarity and the ease of understanding, and on the other hand, attempting to make management systems standards more flexible. We do have this mantra: it needs to be flexible for everyone. And I'm wondering whether or not in future revisions of the various products from TC 283, we can really think clearly about achieving a balance between the clarity and the ease of understanding and the flexibility that we achieve often by putting in words like as appropriate, as applicable, adequate, that really cloud our message and cloud our meaning. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about that one.
So once again, you've given us all sorts of fun things to talk about, Mike. You're very good at leading us down different pathways, I would say. So I'd like to explore a little bit this idea, and perhaps I will come to Martin first and then Katrin, to give Katrin a moment or two longer to think about it, because I know Martin and I have talked about it before. The idea of a new requirements document for smaller organisations. There is concern among some that having a different standard is kind of deviating from standardisation, apart from anything else, because standardisation means it's all the same. But also a concern that if we were to do a document specifically for smaller businesses, the bar would be lowered, that the level of protection wouldn't be as good, and we should never be doing that. And I'd be really interested to hear both Martin and Katrin's views on that, please. Martin, do you think it's something we can achieve without compromising the safety, the health and safety aspects?
Well, I think that has to be the condition, in my mind, for us to entertain the possibility of a different document, Sally. I'm open to the idea that we may want to express the ideas and the key principles of good OH&S practice in different language, and to make sure that the way we do that isn't implicitly describing them in terms that are only applicable or are much more understandable and applicable in the context of a large organization. But I don't think we want to entertain the idea that we will set a lower standard of health and safety for different organizations. There is just one caveat to that, however, which is that I think that particularly perhaps for smaller organizations, and this is something which has been tried in other areas of standardization, I think to do with the environment, that there may be a case for a document which sets out a phased or staged approach through which an organization can progressively build to that common standard, which we would say is the same standard perhaps as you know, which we're expecting of an organization of any size. But I think that there can be some merit, or there may be, and we should explore it and learn what user organizations might feel about setting out effectively a journey through which some basic elements are put in place first, and the organization can make that visible, can self-declare or have some form of independent assurance that it has achieved a certain step on the journey, and then continue that incrementally as and when it has the resources and so on to do so. And that enables it potentially to communicate, what it has in terms of OH&S performance to other the interested parties associated with its business, whether that's people to whom it supplies its products or services, or other stakeholders, to be able to communicate, well, we can answer the OH&S question, and we can show you what we have, and it represents this stage on an end stage journey. So I think there's some scope for that, but I'm uneasy about the end point in terms of OH&S, having a functioning OH&S system being any different to what it would be for any other organization, because that does otherwise, to me, feel like we're setting a lower standard and deliberately therefore saying we will tolerate inferior OH&S performance in these organizations. And I don't think it's necessary to tolerate that. It's about how the organization goes about it. Mike's talked to that. It's about, he mentions documentation. I think standards have gone quite a long way in recent years to try and address the perception that it's all about the documentation, and now we're trying to include a message which says you should have documentation only to the extent it's necessary to enable you to achieve the performance that you're trying to demonstrate. But even so, I think there's a formality implicit in standards, what standards are asking organizations to do, which may not be quite appropriate, or the way we look at that and the way independent assurance looks at that. It's looking for things which perhaps are not really quite the way you would might reasonably find them in a smaller organization. So a bit of a long answer, apologies for that, but I think there's some key things there for me. I do think there's scope to do something different, but not about setting a different standard for safety for workers in smaller organizations. And it might be about the journey of how an organization gets there, where we can begin to get some traction with smaller companies. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. And Katrin, bearing in mind everything Martin has said, which is quite a lot to bear in mind, I apologise. But as a worker representative, somebody who's speaking from the point of view of the worker, do you think it would be worth having a phased implementation, or even a simpler set of requirements for smaller organisations, simply to ensure that something is being done beyond basic legislation? And of course, in Europe, we do have occupational health and safety legislation. It's at a decent level, probably not as good as it could be, but it's pretty good. Other parts of the world don't have that level of legislation. Would it be better to have something rather than nothing? Should we always keep to the same standard regardless? Is this phased idea a good idea? I'd just be really interested in your views on that.
Thank you, Sally. I think the main goal and purpose of the ISO 45001 or the ISO 45000X should be having a good OH management system in place, full stop. Having a more safer and having a safer workplace and protecting the health of the workers, full stop. But the goal and the objective of the standard or implementing the standard should not be just certification. So doing or implementing requirements from ISO 45001 just for the sake of getting a certificate is the wrong approach, I would say. So, and in the case of SMEs, if you look at the standard and you could filter out those requirements which are really guiding you towards a good OH management system standards, these we keep. If you have requirements that would end in a lot of documentation and are not necessarily leading towards a good OH management systems, maybe there is an angle point for having SMEs not to fulfill these requirements. But OH should never be compromised. OH is the main goal of the standard. And when you talk to workers that work in a company that implemented ISO 45001, the first answer you will get, I hate the paperwork. It's too much paperwork. I can't do my job anymore. And when I was a couple of years ago, I was giving birth in the hospital nearby. A nurse came in all the time again and again, and she asked me, can you please, she had so much paperwork to do, can you please answer me this and that and that and that? And I was saying, why do you do all the paperwork? I need you right here. And she said, yes, I know. I'm sorry, we're understaffed, but we need to do the paperwork for the standard, she said. Now, I don't know which standard the hospital was implementing, but paperwork, more paperwork, documentation, and maybe some more requirements which are not leading to good OH management systems. Maybe there's scope for limiting it more and making the requirements that are really key more stronger. But never compromising. From a union point of view, never compromising OH. Thank you, Sai.
Thank you, Katrin. And it's funny, isn't it? The paperwork thing. It always comes back, and it is finding that balance. We often discuss, don't we? What we want is for things to be better. It's not that we want piles and piles of paper and bureaucracy. And I do think that the more recent generation of management system standards, we are making a move in the right direction, away from bureaucracy, more about outcomes. What we want is good performance. Are you achieving your objectives? Not have you got a very detailed library of documents to tell us what you've done. But there's clearly further to go. And with the growth of technologies and that kind of thing, perhaps it can be evolved in different ways. So let's move on to the question of language. We've touched on it already. We've touched on the fact that there are some phrases that some users may not naturally understand or use. We've touched on the fact that some people just don't have the time to read that formal language, to digest it, to work out, to Katrin's point, what is the core requirement here? What is really, really important? Mike has mentioned vague words as appropriate, if necessary. So it's all value judgments. What do you think we should do with language? Is there one solution? Is it several solutions? Where can we evolve? How can we evolve? What should we do to try and get more people to not look at a standard and go, oh my goodness, this is boring, I don't have time for this? How do we move forward? Mike, have you got any ideas?
Well, yes, Sally, I've been giving this a huge amount of thought, and frankly, so has ISO. There are documents in ISO that discuss how language can be structured to be more user-friendly for smaller organizations, which I actually think is quite a good tool. It's Guide 17, I think, is what its designation is. But I believe that let me give you an example. Most of the requirements in 45001 and the other management system standards, for that matter, start with words. The organization shall develop a process to accomplish, hazard identification, for example. Okay, and that added another, 6, 8, 10 words to a very simple sentence that says, identify your hazards. Okay, and then the requirements go on to say, and do it by doing risk assessments and doing, workplace inspections. And I think all of those things are important, and all of those things need to be said, but they need to be said as concisely and as clearly as they can be in order to achieve the target audience. one of the things that I say to myself a lot when I'm writing, and I think would apply, you know, and I suspect has been said quite a few times in TC 283 during standards development, is it's not what you say that matters, it's what they hear that matters. Okay, and to the extent that we can write to make sure that our target audience hears our message, rather than write to make sure that we have delivered the message, that we have actually written the message that's in our heads. And I think we will make stronger standards, and we'll make a broader target audience. You know, so I think using active verbs, you know, identify hazards rather than have a process for hazard identification, for example. Defining terms, and particularly technical terms, and making sure that when we define those terms, the definitions are, the term is used consistently according to that definition. We often use words that have a definition that we think people everywhere understand, but because it's a health and safety technical term, we think it's simple, and perhaps our target audience doesn't. And so I think it's important that we really take a look at how we write and make sure that we're writing for who's listening to us, or who could be listening to us, rather than writing to make sure that we have all of our good ideas on the page. And I also believe, and this is in part the question that Martin and Katrine just talked about. I think we should have those requirements in standards that are effective, and that those things that we as health and safety professionals believe to be good to have, or nice to have, or perhaps complete to have, we should evaluate those and make sure that those things are really essential to having an effective management system. And then, as far as I'm concerned, the one of the reasons we use these words as needed, as appropriate, as applicable in our standard setting is to provide that flexibility that I've talked about, but also to sometimes we achieve consensus that way. And I think it's important that we really, when we feel the need to put one of those words in there, we should really examine what it will mean, and how much time it will take, particularly the small organizations, to try to figure out what we mean when we say as relevant or as equivalent. Okay, those words will take people time, and they will be in my mind, a disincentive to reading the message that we're trying to deliver.
So, Mike, if we had a sentence in ISO 45001 as appropriate, pardon me using that vague term, but for example, saying smaller organisations shall, or should, or something, so there was explicit direction for smaller organisations. Do you think that would help in the absence of a separate document? Would that be something useful to do?
I think it would. I mean, I think it's possible to fold in, if you will, the language that will reach this target audience. I think it is difficult. The problem with doing it, I think, is whether or not they will be able to find the things that belong, that are trying to reach out to them.
Yeah, fair point. I want to come to Katrin, if you don't mind, and ask about different sectors. Different sectors often have their own language, their own jargon. The way they use language is distinct. Do you think it would be helpful if some of our documents, the appropriate documents, I keep using the word, it's clearly very useful, Mike, in some contexts, but if some documents were written specifically for a sector in the language used by that sector, rather than the standardized occupational health and safety management system language? Do you think that would be a useful thing, or is it going to cause more confusion?
It's a difficult question, because if you have a very sector-specific standard, it would make sense. For example, I'm following a set of European standards on letters, and they are very, very sector-specific, using very sector-specific language. But then it's just about letters. And if you write a standard about OH management systems, which can be used by any type of organization across the world, I wonder whether it will be of use to, whether it will be helpful to use sector-specific language. Maybe a sector will recognize itself, whereas another sector wouldn't. So it's a difficult question, but I'm leaning more towards having a more generic and open language that would apply to across all the sectors, and leaving some flexibility so the requirements could be implemented in the context of the very organization. But maybe it's not so much the language we need to take, we need to look at. Maybe it's just the requirements need to be much more clearer. As Mike said, we talk about you have to implement a process. Maybe the language is fine. Maybe the person or the company was trying to implement the standard just does not know what it means. And what could be helpful at that stage. So one is the part where we write the standard, but one is the part where we implement the standard. And when you implement the standard, it's helpful if you have a group of people, the Health and Safety Committee, that sits together and discusses what does this requirement mean, and what does it mean for our company, what does it mean for our workers, and how can we do that within the circumstances, within the context of the organization. And from there, it would be helpful to have, again, maybe a woman sitting in the Health and Safety Committee, because she would say, oh, I know what they mean when they talk about this specific laws on gender equality. They mean that and that, and we could do this and this. So maybe if the standard is not clear, you can compensate it by having more a diverse implementation committee that sits together and brainstorm how to implement the requirements. And something we can do when we write the standard is, I said it before, examples which illustrates, which give best practices. So this is the requirements. They need to be more clearer. But here's some examples what you could do. You don't have to do it, but this is a good way forward. And something which I'm a big fan of is short sentences. We all know how it goes when we sit in a working group meeting and we write the standards. Sometimes it's a battle word for word, and you have a really good sentence, and after you have 1 hour of discussions trying to include or exclude some words here and there, the sentence becomes 3 or 4 lines long and it becomes unreadable. So when we write a standard, keeping it very short and being more specific at definitions, and especially when we look at ISO 45001, I think there could be more definitions added to or even revised. Very often when I read a definition and I read the notes under it, I go like, oh okay, so worker means both unpaid and paid. So for me, having more clarity in the definition and shorter, clear sentence, it's helping already a lot to get the language more clearer. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And again, you make me want to ask you 25 new questions based on the things you've said. But I will let you have a little rest and come to Martin. I think you and I are involved in a ISO group that's looking at the future of management system standards, and some of these issues are coming up. And also ISO is putting a lot of emphasis at the moment on technology, digitization, how we deliver standards. And I think some of this may relate to what Catherine is saying, in that, you know, if we are delivering our documents so that you can hover over a defined term and see what it means each time if you've forgotten, maybe that would help. Where do you think the best ways are to deal with this issue of language and understanding buried requirements? Should we be making the core requirement bold? Should it be bigger than the rest of it and then a box that says, here's some additional information? How would you go about it if you made all the rules?
Wow, that's quite a question, Sally. I think I want to start just with a reflection on thoughts that were prompted by hearing Mike and Catherine speak, because one of the things that reminded me and brought home to me is the fact that some of the words that we have in standards are recognised at the time they're written as being unclear, if we're very honest about it, because they are a compromise language between groups who cannot agree on a common requirement or common recommendation. And we don't resolve those differences. Instead, we find a form of words that everybody can live with. And people go away thinking they've got what they wanted, but it's not the same thing as somebody else thinks those words have led to. And I think we need to be, as standards writers, perhaps more challenging of ourselves in that situation. And I think there is a big enabler that will help us with that. And certainly in TC 283, all our document development is now done virtually. And so we don't have quite the same pressures of, well, we've traveled halfway around the world and the flight's leaving at the end of today and I have to be on that flight. So I have to find a form of words with colleagues that enables me to get on my flight because the document has to be at its next iteration. So we do have, I mean, I think we've seen good work in 283 in the last year or two, where through virtual working, we don't have quite the same time constraints. We can put an extra virtual meeting in to make sure that we have enough time to deal with some points. But I do think we need perhaps to be more alert to those issues. It's exactly as Catherine says, you know, we get out of the room having made a compromise, which we can just about live with, but we're not really happy and we know it doesn't read very well. But actually we're setting up users for a great deal of difficulty in the future, which we're not well placed to resolve, because even if we get clarification questions, we then struggle to clarify the issue because we hadn't really agreed it properly in the first place. So I just throw that in the context of total disclosure. But in terms of what we should do, I think, again, we need to be really mindful. You mentioned, Sally, that you and I are leading the ISO task force, which is looking at the future of ISO management system standards, and what an interesting experience that's proving in terms of diversity of views on the same topic. And we have really a spectrum of views, from people who believe that the language we use today is perfectly fit for purpose, to people who frankly believe almost the opposite. And I think certainly one thing we have all agreed on is that the common core, which sits in all as a backbone to all the requirement specifications like ISO 9001, 14001, 45001, often referred to as Annex SL, the common text, which is there to help us recognize that there is similarity between those standards, and if you want to create an integrated management system, it's jolly useful if the standards have used the same words when they mean the same thing. So there's value in that. Actually, I think the recent discussions have highlighted that the language in that is not particularly complicated. The sentences are relatively short, to Catherine's point. It could be better. I'd be the first to say that. I don't think we always need to say the organisation shall establish, implement and maintain a process. We could say once at the front of the document, processes need to be established, they need then to be implemented, and you need to continually maintain them. And that would apply to any process we go on to describe in our document. So we could simplify things a little bit that way. But I think that where it tends to get more problematic is when committees then take that common text and they add their discipline-specific content on top of it. And they don't just do that by adding some extra paragraphs following that text. We very often interfere with the flow of that text and we add a few extra words into a sentence. Well, actually, by the time you've done that, you can end up with really quite a convoluted text with some very long sentences. And I think we need to make more use of those clarity indices and other standard tests on readability to really catch ourselves when we find that we've done that and we've ended up with a text which is overcomplicated. But do you want me to go on also, you sort of touched on it, Sally, do you want me to talk about where I think technology can help in the future? I'm taking that body, okay, I'm taking that body language to be a yes. I think two things where really technology could make a huge difference. Technology that would make it easier for users and interested parties to comment on standards and to give us the feedback which says, what on earth are you talking about? Or that just doesn't make sense. Or are you really saying this? And that's very difficult to do in the current standards development process. You have to fill in a rather fiddly word template, setting out your justification and the precise words you want to change. And it's pretty clunky and it's pretty time consuming. There's a new system ISO's developing which will enable you to provide comments much in the way you would put track changes directly into a document. I think there's an opportunity there to really open up participation, to make it a lot easier for people to give us feedback on documents and indeed to see what other people's feedback is on our documents rather than the process we have today. But I think there's another trick with technology. At the moment, if you're using 3 standards, maybe our requirements standard, the guidance specific to smaller organizations, maybe our guidance 45003 on psychological health, all of those are relevant to your organization. You're effectively stuck with 3 PDFs side by side trying to work out how to knit them together. Technology can and should deliver that for you. You specify the type of organization you are, the kind of standards you want to, content you want to see, and you get it all in one place in one document. And again, I think that's going to make users' lives a lot easier. Thank you, Sally.
That really does come back to Katrine's earlier point, doesn't it? Put it all in one document. Maybe the technology will enable us to get everything we need in one place without it all being in one document. And maybe that is one of the things that we should be thinking about going forwards. We only have 7 minutes left, so I am going to take us towards the end of this session. And I'd like to ask each of you, is there one thing you would like to see change to make standards more exclusive and more accessible? And I'm going to be kind and come to Katrine first. You get the first choice. So if you take it, Mike and Martin have to come up with something else. What one thing would you do?
I think Mike and Martin will have a different thing to mention because one thing that I would like to change, or that we would like to change, is involving the unions more in the standardization process. It's the most easiest and it's the most complicated. The easiest because having worker representatives and unions in your standardization committee means we bring so much expertise and so much know-how, because as I said before, the workers are the frontliners. They know about what is happening in the company. They know about the risk, but they also know about the solutions. They have good ideas. And if we bring that forward to the standard writing platform, it could be so much more enriching the standard. But it's also the most complicating because it's very difficult for unions to get involved into standardization. It starts with having no resources. Unions have to deal with so much, and the crises are coming at such a fast speed. We're trying to deal with, and standardization is just not a priority. So it is very difficult for us. I'm very countries in Europe, I don't know abroad, but in Europe you have to pay a lot of money to be part of a mirror committee. So we see very, very few unionists in mirror committees, even though they represent the majority of the stakeholders, workers. They're often a minority and they're easily voted out. And even if you see a unionist in the standardization committee, it means he or she has come a long way, because it's not easy. But there are a few tricks and hacks that we could do to hear them more, even though they don't have the means to participate. So when you are in the National Mirror Committee and you're addressing standards or issues that have some impact on workers, do an outreach. If you're a national standardization body, call them, ask them, send them an email, inform them just that you're right about the standard. And if they have the time, maybe they come. If they can't, maybe they give you 10 minutes phone call and have half of the questions that you have answered. So it's, yeah, this is something the ETUC has been fighting a lot for, and it's very frustrating because we see it's very difficult to get on board of a mirror committee. So when we don't participate, but we just send a letter, here's out, we have good points, even though we can't be there. And yes, so it would be really good to involve more unions in the standardization writing process, but also afterwards when a company implements the standards. And a lot has been done by this clause 5.4 in ISO 45001, which is, by the way, reused, and it serves for inspiration for a lot of other standards, not OH standards, but other standards for human resource management, for governance, for others. And they use that clause of ISO 45001 and use it in their standards. So it's really a good thing. It was just the first of its kind, and now it's being used in other standards. That's good. But so we have there the potential of including union or worker representatives. Do that when you implement a standard in your company, and do that when you go through the auditing process, because there it goes wrong many times because auditors may not be familiar with what worker representatives can do, and then they don't involve them. So without taking too much more time, because we're closing, the one thing I would like to change is having more union and worker representatives on board of standardization.
Thank you, Katrin. It's a really important point, and I'm glad you've made it. Do remember, everybody, all standards go out for public consultation at some point. So even if your unions can't get in the mirror committees, try and use those moments to influence and put some voices in. It's different everywhere, but I agree, we need the union input. Please do what you can to influence. Okay, Mike, in one sentence, what one thing would you do? Sorry, Katrin took the bulk of that one, but it was a good point. So
absolutely, you know that one sentence is not my best suit, but I'm hoping that over the next year or two, we can find some way of better understanding the needs of our target audiences. And the differences between the target audiences that direct those needs. So I'm hoping that through the technology and through the good work of the many people involved in TC 283, and I think even more important, the mirror committees and our regional representatives, ways of gathering information about how people receive our message, how they understand our message, and how we can make sure that our message is has the most impact. Not one sentence, I'm sorry.
I'm getting to the point where I'm giving Martin 10 words. But what one thing would you like to leave our audience with, Martin?
Well, just one thing we haven't touched on, but it sort of still, I think, is very relevant. I'd like to see more younger people involved in standards development, both in our TC, in our mirror committees, and participating in the public comment process. And why? Because I'm keen that we hear the voices of people earlier in their careers in OH&S, because they are our target audience, and we at our peril end up as a group of seasoned experts who end up writing standards, written as experts and written for experts, and the experts are the last people who need our standards. We should be very much focusing, I think, on inclusive, not only on, but we certainly should have firmly in our minds young professionals early into responsibilities for OH&S, and ask the question, are we really helping those people? And if not, what do we do about it? Thank you, Sally.
Yeah, brilliant point. Thank you, Martin. And these events too, we want different speakers. If you're interested in part of being one of these discussions, we want new ideas. We want different thinking. You don't want to hear from the same people all the time. We don't want to hear from the same people all the time. Bring us your ideas and your thoughts and let's exchange them. We are here to help you. That is our whole purpose, is to help people around the world. And that means we need to hear from everybody, not the same few people. So please do have a look at our website, do email us, let us know your thoughts, your ideas, your concerns. And if you can, get involved with your National Mirror Committee. If there are barriers to getting involved, as Katrin was suggesting there are in some countries, at least use the public consultation process. Every standard goes through it. It's out for about 3 months, and that should give you time to read, to digest, and put some ideas in. But most of all, thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Huge thanks to Martin, to Katrin, and to Mike for sharing their ideas with us and going through this very fast discussion. I hope you'll all join us tomorrow. Our next event is at 0600 UTC, and we'll be looking at the difficulties, the challenges of effective health and safety performance evaluation. Hope to see you there. Thank you, everybody. Bye.